Before I begin, I want to say that all the incidents shared here are real and collected from many people. Some events may seem small, some big, and some unusual that is completely natural. I am telling the story exactly as I collected it. I am starting with the first story. Last year, I moved to Siliguri, India, to study. I stayed in a public hostel that was over 70 years old. I lived on the top floor with 2 roommates. I had a habit of studying late into the night, often until 3 a.m., while my roommates would fall asleep by 11 p.m. One night, around 2 a.m., I was studying by my table lamp. Suddenly, there was a loud knock on my window. I ignored it at first, thinking it was just the wind. But 10 minutes later, the knocking returned, much louder this time. Then, I heard the sound of someone sobbing uncontrollably right outside. My room was on the 4th floor. There was no way a person could be standing outside my window. I summoned my courage and opened the door to the balcony. Sitting there, huddled in a corner, was a young girl wearing a white traditional dress. She was crying into her hands. This was an all-boys hostel. It was impossible for a girl to be there at 2 a.m. I tried to step closer to help her, but my legs felt like they were glued to the floor. The girl slowly turned her head toward me. She didn't have a face, just smooth, pale skin where her eyes and mouth should have been. She began to stand up, floating slightly off the ground. I fainted from terror. My roommates found me on the floor the next morning. When I asked the hostel cook about it later, he turned pale. He told me that years ago, a girl had committed suicide in that very spot. Many students had seen her, but only those who stayed up past 2 a.m. heard her crying. I never studied late again. A few years ago, my school organized a field trip to a quiet countryside village, far away from the noise of the city. I was running late and missed the school bus. Seeing how upset I was, our family driver, an uncle who had driven in the village and city for 20 years, offered to take me there in his car. He promised we would arrive even before the bus. We left at 9 a.m. The weather was beautiful, sunny, and clear. But as we drove, something strange happened. It felt like we had been on the road for 4 hours, but when I looked at my watch, only 1 minute had passed. Suddenly, the sky turned ink black. A rain so heavy it felt like buckets of water were being poured onto the car began to fall. The veteran driver, who knew every road in the city, looked lost. "I don't know where we are," he whispered. We were surrounded by a thick, dark jungle that shouldn't have been there. The car engine suddenly died. The driver stepped out to check the hood. A moment later, I heard a blood-curdling scream. I called his name, but there was no answer. I gathered my courage and stepped out into the pouring rain. I found the driver lying unconscious in the mud. Then, I looked up at a massive palm tree nearby. Standing on top of the tree was a figure nearly 8 feet tall. The entire figure was made of burning, orange fire. Even in that heavy rain, the flames didn't go out. They burned brighter and hotter. The fire demon began to float through the air toward me, reaching out its flaming hands with a terrifying, silent smile. I fainted from pure terror. When I woke up, I was in my own bed at home. My family told me a story that made no sense. They said that both the driver and I had been found unconscious on the rooftops of 2 different houses, miles away from where the accident had happened. We were lying in an impossible position. Our heads were pointing down toward the roof while our legs were sticking straight up into the air, as if we had been dropped from the sky. Stranger still, our car was found perfectly parked at the picnic spot in Ashulia, right where we were supposed to be. Both the driver and I had the exact same experience. To this day, we don't know how we were transported across the city in an instant, or why that flaming entity decided to play with our lives. When my older sister was only 7 years old, We lived in a small, quiet town. Back then, we had old yellow light bulbs that cast long, flickering shadows on the walls. My sister had a strange hobby. She loved playing with those shadows, making shapes with her hands. My parents constantly scolded her, saying, "Don't play with shadows. It brings sickness and bad luck." But she never listened. One night, she woke up and saw the shadow of a man running across her wall. Instead of being afraid, she was excited. She started playing with the shadow man every night in secret. She thought he was her imaginary friend. Years later, we moved to city. My sister had grown up and completely forgotten about her childhood shadow friend. But the shadow hadn't forgotten her. One night, around 3:30 a.m., she was jolted awake by a terrifying sound, the slow, rhythmic creak of her bedroom window opening. She lay frozen, facing the window. In the dim light, she saw it. The same tall shadow man from her childhood was standing by her bed. She closed her eyes tight, praying it was just a hallucination. But then, she felt a wave of hot air wash over her body. Suddenly, she heard a sound that made her blood run cold. The sound of water being poured from a jug into a glass on her bedside table. But she was alone in the room. Before she could react, she felt a massive weight sit on her feet. She tried to move, but she was completely paralyzed. It felt like sleep paralysis, but much more violent. The invisible weight began to press down on her legs with crushing force. She tried to scream, but her throat felt like it was filled with ice. The pain was unbearable. It felt like her bones were about to snap. Just as she thought she would die from the pain, the morning call to prayer began to echo from the nearby mosque. Instantly, the weight vanished. She sat up, screaming in agony. Her legs were throbbing. The next morning when I visited her, she couldn't even stand up. Her legs were swollen and covered in dark, purplish bruises that looked exactly like human handprints. The shadow friend from her childhood had returned, and this time, he wasn't there to play. Some friends are better left in the past, especially those who hide in the shadows. This story was told to me by my uncle, who grew up in Karachi, Pakistan, during the 1960s. Near his government quarters, there was a deep, 40-foot ravine by the roadside. It was a dangerous, cursed place where people claimed bodies were often dumped. No one dared to go near it after sunset. When my uncle was in the 5th grade, he had to deliver food to a relative's house across the ditch. By the time he started walking back, the sun had set. The path was lonely and silent. Suddenly, he saw 3 women walking ahead of him. They were all dressed in long white traditional garments, with their heads covered in flowing veils. Relieved to have company, he hurried to catch up to them, but no matter how fast he walked, the distance between them stayed exactly the same. When he reached the end of the path near the streetlights, he finally managed to pass them. He turned around to say hello, but the words died in his throat. The women had no veils over their faces. Their skin was pitch black and covered in deep, glowing red cracks. When they opened their mouths, their tongues were black with red veins, and their eyes were filled with a terrifying, ancient hunger. They weren't walking. They were gliding an inch above the ground. He ran home and collapsed. That night, he woke up in the dark and saw all 3 figures standing around his bed. They began to touch his legs with ice-cold hands. He tried to scream, but he was paralyzed. When his family finally broke into the room, the figures vanished. His legs were covered in dark red bruises, bruises that stayed for weeks as a reminder of the night he followed the women of the ditch. During a time of political unrest and strict curfews, my relatives were staying in their family home. The head of the family was away, leaving only his mother-in-law and 2 young brother-in-laws in the house. Late one night, amidst the deadly silence of the curfew, they heard a loud, aggressive knock on the main gate. A thin, scratchy voice called out, "I am your uncle. Is this the right house?" Thinking it was a prank or a relative in trouble, they opened the door. The yard was completely empty. The heavy iron gate was still locked with chains from the inside. There was no way a human could have entered or escaped that fast. Terrified, they ran back inside and locked their bedroom door. Immediately, the banging started again, not on the gate, but on their bedroom door. It sounded like someone was trying to kick it down with heavy boots. Then, they heard a horrific sound. The bamboo fence outside was being ripped apart by invisible hands, piece by piece. Suddenly, a loud thud hit the roof. Then another. And another. It began to rain, but it wasn't water. Thousands of broken pieces of red bricks were falling from the sky, smashing onto the roof and the yard. The sound was deafening, like a war zone. The family huddled in the center of the room, praying as the house shook. At dawn, the rain of bricks stopped. When the mother went outside for morning prayers, she was shocked. The entire yard was covered in 2 inches of red brick dust and sharp, broken stones. Strangely, a pile of bricks that had been sitting in front of a neighbor's house was now gone, transported by the spirits to attack their home. They later called a holy man to cleanse the house. As he tried to step inside, an invisible force grabbed his ankle and twisted his foot violently from right to left. He couldn't even put his foot on the ground. He finally managed to enter and perform a ritual to close the house, but the haunting never truly stopped. To this day, the temperature in those rooms will suddenly drop to freezing cold or jump to boiling heat in seconds. They are moving out next month, because once a house is claimed by the unseen, it no longer belongs to the living. Years later, my uncle experienced another strange encounter in a remote village in eastern Turkey. He had missed the last ferry across a deep river and decided to walk the 15-mile journey through lonely riverside paths. Near an abandoned mansion, a shopkeeper warned him, "Don't walk past the ruins tonight. Something else is out there." But my uncle kept going. Near a large tree, he saw a shriveled old woman sitting in the dirt. She asked, "Where are you going, son?" When he told her, she said, "I am going that way too. Let's walk together." Even though she looked ancient and weak, she walked with incredible speed. My uncle struggled to keep up. Whenever he tried to speak, she would snap, "Don't talk, just walk." As they walked, my uncle noticed something strange in the fields to his left. He saw hundreds of people standing in the dark, whispering and staring at him. He wanted to stop, but the old woman kept pushing him forward. They reached a small river crossing. Both my uncle and the woman climbed into a boat. When they reached the other side, my uncle handed the boatman money for 2 people. The boatman stared at him, his face turning pale. "Why money for 2? You crossed this river alone." There was no one else in the boat. My uncle spun around. The seat next to him was empty. The woman had vanished. A mile further, he saw her again, sitting under another tree. This time, she looked younger, but her body was still skeletal. She looked at him and whispered, "The path behind us was full of hungry ghosts. I only walked with you to make sure they didn't take you. Now, go home and don't look back." She dissolved into thin air. He realized then that in the dark, the most terrifying spirits aren't always your enemies. Sometimes, they are the only ones keeping you alive.